Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 13 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, last week, other than the Tolkien's vacation in Italy, which, and that sounds wonderful, we focused on the last-minute issues that Tolkien had with the publication of The Return of the King. He was concerned about the page proofs, the queries, the corrections, and the dwarf runes, and we also read a few of the earliest reviews. Today, we're going to take a look back with Tolkien at The Lord of the Rings, now that it's done and out there. We're going to start with a letter that Tolkien wrote before The Return of the King was published. That's letter number 163 to W.H. Auden, written in June of 1955. Now, I've read parts of it on earlier Tolkien Tuesdays, but the bits I'll read today speak directly to Tolkien's thoughts on his own work. I do not really think that I am frightfully important. I wrote the trilogy as a personal satisfaction, driven to it by the scarcity of literature of the sort that I wanted to read. I was not thinking much of the profit or delight of others, though no one can really write or make anything purely privately. Now, before I go on, I want to be clear that when Tolkien says I wrote the trilogy in this letter, he is echoing Auden's own words from the letter that he had sent to Tolkien. In letter number 149, he wrote to Rainer Unwin, trilogy, which is not really accurate, is partly to blame for the shapelessness that some readers complained about. In letter 165, he explained that the book is not, of course, a trilogy. That and the titles of the volumes was a fudge thought necessary for publication, owing to length and cost. There is no real division into three, nor is any one part intelligible alone. The story was conceived and written as a whole. I just had to square that up. So, back to the letter to Auden, he says that he's finished the story so long ago now that I can take a largely impersonal view of it. He talks about finding people's interpretations quite amusing. Tolkien says that he, quote, had very little particular conscious intellectual intention in mind at any point. Now, the one exception Tolkien does take, though, is to, quote, interpretations in the mode of simple allegory, that is, the particular and topical. So even then, he was clear to point out this is not an allegory. But unlike the famous bit in the foreword to the second edition, where he expresses his cordial dislike for allegory, he does make a very interesting allowance here that I really want to call to your attention. It's beautiful, beautiful writing right here. Tolkien says, in a larger sense, it is, I suppose, impossible to write any story that is not allegorical in proportion as it comes to life, since each of us is an allegory, embodying in a particular tale, enclothed in the garments of time and place, universal truth and everlasting life. Each of us is an allegory. I think I'll explore that someday, but today is not that day. Going back to more of Tolkien's own words on his work, the rest of letter 163 is truly fantastic. It has some stuff on the languages that I really want to come back to in a future episode. But we're going to move on to more of his own words on his work. In letter number 165, Tolkien gives an answer to the question, what is it all about? Saying, it is not about anything but itself. Certainly, it has no allegorical intentions, general, particular, or topical, moral, religious, or political. The only criticism that annoyed me, Tolkien says, was one that it contained no religion and no women, but that does not matter and is not true anyway. It is a monotheistic world of natural theology. The odd fact that there are no churches, temples, or religious rites and ceremonies is simply part of the historical climate depicted. It will be sufficiently explained if, as now seems likely, the Silmarillion and other legends of the First and Second Ages are published. I am in any case myself a Christian, Tolkien says, but the Third Age was not a Christian world. Moving on now to post-publication, letter number 173 was written 4 days after Return of the King was published. He says, I am indeed surprised at the reception of The Ring and immensely pleased, but I don't think I've started any tide. I don't think such a small hobbit-like creature, or even a man of any size, does that. If there is a tide, I think there is, then I am just lucky enough to have caught it, being just a bit of it. His humility still strikes me even now, but I can't blame him then. It was 1955, and he had no clue how this was going to shape the future of fantasy literature. Now, moving on to letter number 180, it was written to an unidentified reader named simply Mr. Thompson in January of 1956, and it has some interesting bits along these lines. First, Tolkien admits that he set myself a task, the arrogance of which I fully recognized and trembled at, being precisely to restore to the English an epic tradition and present them with a mythology of their own. It is a wonderful thing to be told that I have succeeded. Shades of letter number 131 there, where Tolkien famously said to Milton Waldman that he wanted to make a body of more or less connected legend, which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. Now, letter 180 also connects to the Silmarillion when he tells Mr. Thompson that the collection of older myths was turned down for publication, but that good may come of such blows. The Lord of the Rings was the result. I love that. Now, the draft of this letter, which was never completed or sent, ends with this paragraph. However, such has been the success, not financial. Costs were enormous, and nobody nowadays buys a book that they can borrow. I have not yet received a farthing. Of the Lord of the Rings, that the ugly duckling has become a publisher's swan, and I am being positively bullied to put the Silmarillion into form and anything else. Not yet received a farthing? Well, let's just say the royalty checks hadn't been sent yet. Maybe he needed to give them his PayPal address. As we read in Carpenter, by now it had become clear that The Lord of the Rings was not going to lose £1,000 for Allen and Unwin. Sales of the book increased steadily, if not yet remarkably. They were boosted by a radio dramatization of the book, which inevitably did not meet with Tolkien's approval. More on this next week, as I will spend most, if not all of the episode going over that broadcast and his thoughts on it. I know I've teased that for a little while. Back to Carpenter's biography. However, the radio broadcasts contributed to the book's popularity, and early in 1956, Tolkien received his first payment from Allen and Unwin under the half-profits agreement, a check for more than £3,500. Now, I did some calculations. I went on the internet and found out about inflation values and all of that. That is about £112,000 or about $140,000 in today's currency. Just his first check. 3 months after the books were published. Carpenter continues, this was considerably more than his annual salary from the university. And though he was, of course, delighted, he also realized that income tax was going to be a very serious problem. Sales rose even more during 1956, and the check that he received a year later was substantially larger. Enough so that his tax concerns led him to accept the offer of Marquette University when they reached out to inquire about purchasing the manuscripts of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Manuscripts that I've been fortunate enough to see at Marquette when the Prancing Pony podcast did our in-person moot last October. Now, next time, and I promise this time, we'll finally get to that adaptation I've been teasing and that Carpenter directly mentioned in this episode. But that wraps it up for this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show and get an ad-free feed, a monthly hangout with me, a bonus weekly episode, and a lot more. Finally, join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps and follow at Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok because eventually I will start doing stuff there. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.